In 1802, 60 passengers set sail from Falmouth, England, along with over 200 tons of trade goods on a merchant ship called the Obra Dinn. 6 months later, when it hadn't shown up at its designated destination in South Africa, it was deemed lost at sea and everyone aboard assumed dead. Fast forward to October 14th, 1807, and the Obra Dinn has mysteriously found its way home to Falmouth with not a single soul in sight. You are a Chief Inspector of Insurance and Claims for the East India Company's London office, and as soon as you hear word that the Obra Dinn has returned, you immediately dispatch to Falmouth and with the help of a local ferryman, climb aboard the Obra Dinn. What begins as a simple job of assessing the damages done to the ship quickly becomes a murder mystery unlike anything you've seen before. Welcome to Supercut, the series where we take an entire Let's Play and squash it into one video. My name is Mr. Supercut. Join me as we climb aboard and set sail to uncover the mystery surrounding the return of the Obra Dinn. Upon arrival at the Obra Dinn, the ship is completely desolate aside from a single rotting skeleton. After a quick look around, you jump back into the small rowboat that got you here and pull out a book from your belongings. In the book, there's a letter written by a Henry Evans, who says that he had every intention of telling the strange tale of what happened those few years prior, but with his health failing, he was only able to manage writing the basic outline. He tasks you with two things. Firstly, to use the pocket watch to find out the fates of everyone who was aboard the Obra Dinn, and secondly, to return the book by guaranteed post to the French Office of Affairs in Morocco. A quick flick through the book shows the basic outline that Evans was able to conjure up with a contents page and a chapters page. You put the book away and then pull out the pocket watch that Evans had referenced. You head back up and pull out the watch next to the rotted corpse and are transported to a frozen moment in time, showing you how the unknown skeleton died. What Henry Evans had written now begins to make sense. This is the premise of Return of the Obra Dinn. This is a best played blind type of game, and if you want to experience the magic for yourself, I suggest you turn back now. Consider yourself warned that this video will spoil the entire game. Firstly, we'll be going through how I completed the game and how I determined the fates and identities of all 60 characters. The game does not follow a chronological time frame, so once we've completed the first part, we'll be diving into the story from beginning to the end so we can fully understand and appreciate the intricacies of the plot. Our first scene hears two men attempting to break into the captain's quarters to steal some shells, but before they could break down the door, assumedly the captain bursts out of the room and blasts one of them to Kingdom Come. The scene quickly fades to black and we flip open our book to page 125, chapter 10, part 1, where we're asked these simple questions: who is this and how did they die? On the pages we get a transcript of the dialogue with the victim marked with an X, a blurry photo of the deceased, and two other references stating where the victim died on the ship and who else was present in the scene. From the get-go we can deduce that this unknown soul was shot with a gun by the captain, whose name is Robert Whittrell. After closing the book, I was able to explore the scene a little further, finding a third man climbing the stairs with a knife in his mouth, assumedly to sneak up on the captain from behind. After exiting the scene through a magic portal, I was transported back to modern times and was able to pass through what was once a locked door. Inside, I found two more rotted corpses. The next scene found the captain violently slashing the other man's throat, whilst the unknown man stabbed the captain in the shoulder. Outside, we could see the man who'd been shot, and upstairs we could just about make out the third man hopping over the back of the ship, also seeing him from below. Who is this? We don't know. How did they die? Knifed by the captain. I hurried out and moved to the next skeleton. In the next scene we see the captain having pulled the spiky stick from his shoulder, swing it round and club the third man in the skull, but not before he managed to stab the captain in the kidney. I headed through to the next room to find a woman lying in a bed. Considering that there was a street brawl happening 3 feet away from her, either she'd been knocked out with horse tranquilizers or she was dead. Who is this? We don't know. How did they die? Clubbed by the captain. And finally, after heading through the magic portal, we pulled the stopwatch out on a final pile of bones, assumedly the captain's, and we hear this dialogue.
Abigail, Your brother, my friend, I shot him dead. I'll be with you soon, my love. Please forgive me for everything.
We can very clearly see that the captain committed suicide after leaving a trail of blood and misery throughout his quarters. After opening the book, the game gave me a quick tutorial on the photos. When a photo was no longer blurred, it meant that we had all the relevant information to deduce exactly who it was. Who is this? Captain Robert Whittrell. How did he die? Suicide by gun. Then the game announced that this may or may not be correct. I would need to correctly identify 3 people and their fates to find out if they were correct or not. I then opened up the transcript to find some interesting information. Firstly, this told us that the woman lying in the bed was named Abigail and the captain had shot her brother. Also, by the fact that he'd called her my love, meant we could assume she was his wife. I exited the scene and thus we had found all the fates of chapter 10. Flicking over the page, I noticed that the unknown soul's picture was no longer blurred, meaning based on the 4 scenes we'd seen so far, I now had enough information to deduce who this was. I headed to page 3 to find a log of the ship's crew and located Abigail, who appeared to have 2 surnames, Hoscut and Whittrell. Whittrell was obviously the captain's surname and Hoscut was shared with one other person on board, William Hoscut, the first mate. I popped it in and closed the book. I then headed round to Abigail's skeleton and used the pocket watch being transported to a truly horrifying scene. Our immediate image was of Abigail clearly being crushed by some sort of pole, and as we spun around, we were greeted by a monstrous kraken's tentacles creeping over the side of the ship, holding the rigging that had crushed Abigail. We also saw a man diving out of the way, a sailor aiming his sorry pistol at the gargantuan beast, 2 women cowering behind a man, and the top half of a man being dragged away by his friend. Quick side note, there are obviously other people in this scene, but in this playthrough I didn't notice them at this point. We then opened the book to page 72, chapter 7, part 8. Who is this? Abigail Hoscut Whittrell. How did they die? Crushed by falling rigging. The pocket watch suddenly began to vibrate, and after clicking it, it drew my attention to the man that had been ripped in half. Back in the present day, I followed a mysterious trail of light, which revealed a ghostly image of the man torn in half, which, after using the pocket watch, took us to our next ghastly scene. We're greeted by the shredded man being embraced by the Kraken, a man in a stripy t-shirt attempting to fend off the beast with a stick, a man launching a spear at the beast's tentacles, a capsized lifeboat and 3 flying men, 2 men playing catch with a rifle, and some more. Who is this? We don't know, however the unblurred image suggests that we should know. How did they die? Torn apart by a terrible beast. I scanned the ship's crew but couldn't determine who I was supposed to be looking for, so hit the pocket watch and headed over to the next scene. The scene opens with someone shouting, and a man suspended in midair engulfed in what appears to be a fireball. Assumedly the powder was a bomb of sorts. The man had a rope tied around his waist and someone was attempting to pull him back onto the ship, but of course not before he was blown apart. There was also our torn man with his bottom half still intact and 2 men stumbling up the stairs carrying a large pile of rifles. Nobody else was about, suggesting that they were all still below deck. I opened the book and headed to the dialogue and was surprised to see that the one who'd shouted "throw the powder" was not the one who died, otherwise there would be a cross beside his name. Who is this? We don't know. How did they die? Blasted by an explosion. Back in the present, I headed below deck to find a bunch of cannons all over the place and a skeleton beneath one of them. In the next scene, I found a man being crushed by a cannon who had a distinctive Scottish accent, or so I thought. And just across the way, a headless corpse lying on the ground along with another man having been crushed by another cannon. Who is this? We don't know. How did they die? Crushed by a cannon. The next scene took me to the headless corpse, which saw a body being blasted by a cannon currently embroiled in a wrestling match with the giant squid, along with another body stuck beneath that same cannon. However, there were apparently two bodies that had been blasted by the cannon, but I could only see one. Who are these? We don't know. How did they die? I assume blasted by a cannon, but as I couldn't find one of the bodies, I kept it as I didn't know. The next scene took us to the body crushed beneath the cannons and found the poor unfortunate soul being crushed to death by the Kraken whilst holding a torch ready to light the fuse of the cannon. We also saw the two victims from the previous memory, the one with the hat being crushed against the opening of the barrel of the cannon, and the other that had seemingly vanished, trying to pry the Kraken's tentacles off of his friend. Who is this? We don't know. How did they die? Crushed by a terrible beast. Back in the present, I could now enter through a door that was previously locked and found a couple of bones and a broken piece of wood. From the sound of it, whoever this was had clearly been engaged in some defecatory activity and was unfortunately crushed by a slithery tentacle at his most vulnerable point. Inside the ship, several of the men were going about their duties and routines and remained blissfully unaware of what was about to unfold. The image was but a signature, insinuating that this poor soul was actually the artist who'd drawn the pictures we'd been using. Who is this? A quick scan of the crew brought us to Edward Spratt, the artist. How did they die? Crushed by a terrible beast. Above deck, another plot was unfolding as we found yet another body. The final scene of Chapter 7 opened with this dialogue.
Let me on.
Over my dead body, you bloody Dane.
Huh? How's that?
There's no cause for trouble, boys. Get in the boat.
Thought I'd forget. You killed my brother.
What? That was an accident. The ropes.
It wasn't his fault. I saw the whole thing.
Lies. I shouldn't have waited so long.
No, don't.
The scene itself showed this poor gentleman being clubbed to death by this brute of a man as two others watched on in horror. Who is this? Well, according to the dialogue, the murderer called the victim a Dane, meaning Danish from Denmark. A quick scan of the crew revealed just one man from Denmark, so this was Lars Lind. How did he die? He was clubbed by an unknown attacker. After finishing all the parts within the chapter, we reached the conclusion which stated that 7 people had actually disappeared and asked the questions, who is this and what fate befell them. I opened up the character sheet for the man who clubbed Lars Lind and had perused the crew log as he had mentioned that Lars had killed his brother, so I was looking for 2 men who shared the same surname, and I eventually stumbled upon Samuel and Nathan Peters. I jumped back into one of the memories to determine what happened to him and assumed that the upturned lifeboat with 3 men on board was the lifeboat that was being boarded in part 1 of this chapter. I popped in Samuel Peters was drowned by a terrible beast, but nothing happened, so I assumed I didn't have enough fates yet. I skimmed across to the half man's page and tried 3 different names from eastern regions, none of which worked, but decided to stick with Maba from New Guinea. I then went back to the brother and changed his name to Nathan Peters. With 6 fates down and 54 to go, I turned to Lars Lind and updated his fate to having been clubbed by Nathan Peters. I then turned my attention to a man we hadn't seen yet, who in his photo appeared to be holding the ship's wheel. Who is this? Finlay Dalton, the helmsman. How did he die? We didn't know yet. I checked the scene with the lifeboat, but he wasn't there, along with the scene of the explosion, but he wasn't there either, and then finally checked the scene where Abigail got crushed and found him clinging on for dear life as the Kraken pulled him to his doom. I popped his fate in as torn apart by a terrible beast and carried on to find one more fate. I headed below deck and came across a closed door with a pool of blood seeping out from underneath it, along with a bloodied knife. I reached out, pulled the handle, and found a pile of bones. In the dialogue for this scene, we hear 2 men talking and 2 other names are mentioned. The dying man mentioned how he tried to save another man called Pete.
Tell Pete's mother I tried my best.
Aye.
to pull him back, to save him.
And then the other man called for Brennan to bring the surgeon's kit.
Brennan! Bring the surgeon's kit!
The dying man was unknown, but the other turned out to be William Hoscott, the first mate. I headed out of the room to find one of the men who'd been killed by the captain in chapter 10, standing over 2 dead bodies. My immediate assumption was that because he had his hand to his ear, as if he'd just been called, this was Henry Brennan. More fates under my belt, I was beginning to feel good about how things were going. But back to the corpse at hand. I opened the book to page 117, chapter 9, part 6. Who is this? We don't know yet. How did they die? Knifed by an unknown attacker. Before continuing with this chapter, I decided to head to a previous scene first, as I had a feeling that I knew who this Pete was that the unnamed murder victim was referring to. I found the knifed man holding a rope and attempting to pull the exploded man back to the ship, meaning his name was Peter Milroy, as he was the only Peter I could find on the ship's log. I then headed back down to the next scene to find Brennan bashing someone holding a gun over the head with a bat, another man lying on the ground with his head blown off, and Hoscott heading down the stairs, finding the previous murder victim crawling along the ground with a knife in his back. Who is this? We don't know. How did they die? Clubbed by Henry Brennan. After that, I moved on to the next scene, the headless corpse lying on the floor, and the dialogue was most interesting.
Captain Campbell.
You have a plan?
Yes. Take ship and sail east. Trade resin fish and shells for gold. Hey, who's there?
Mutiny! Mutiny!
Fresh bastard!
No!
Some men were discussing how they could overthrow the captain before they were interrupted by a little spy who screamed out mutiny. In the scene, we saw the moment the man got his head blown off, the man who'd been stabbed in the back, and the 3 musketeers on the top deck, with one of them just casually launching another crewmate off the side of the ship, beside a sword and a pool of blood. And lastly, the captain was stood there with his head in his hands. Who is this? We don't know. How did they die? Shot with a gun by an unknown attacker. What we did find out though was the one that was killed was the one who instigated the plan to overthrow the captain. I then moved on to the next scene. A few grunts followed by a commanding yell to let them go in a familiar voice, followed then by a loud blast, revealed an interesting scene indeed. This unknown man was stood on the side of the ship, sword in hand, with a mass of blood spurting from his back, and after looking over the side, one of the women in a lifeboat was aiming a rifle straight up. On the floor beside him was a bloodied corpse and sword, and the rest of the gang were creeping up the stairs to find out what was going on. Who is this? We don't know yet. How did they die? He was shot with a gun by an unknown attacker. I then saw the captain pointing his gun at the same man, and I'm pretty certain he was the one who shouted, "Let them go." I headed down the stairs and found the unfortunate moment where the man who'd had his head blown off and wanted to instigate mutiny actually found the little spy just before stabbing him in the back. He also had a gun attached to his hip, which was likely the gun used to blow his own head off. I then headed into the next scene and heard that some of the passengers were looking to leave when suddenly someone arrived to stop them from taking the last lifeboat. The woman cried out for Paul to watch out, but unfortunately he was stabbed. The captain was on his way up, still shouting to let them go, and below deck I found the spy hiding behind the door, where the 2 conspirators were sat beside a corpse who'd had his arm ripped clean off. Who is this? Paul Moss. How did they die? Killed with a sword by an unknown attacker. The last scene of this chapter took me below deck to the man with one arm.
Put me down! Let go!
Easy now. You're in a bad way.
It's the squid. Where is my Frenchman?
The squid's gone. Your mate was torn apart.
The that. The beast is dead. How did you kill it?
We didn't. It left with the storm. Captain came up from the hold. Said he chased it off. You should rest.
A curse like that does not live
for nothing.
So after that dialogue, the man died, but there was a lot to take in from what he said. Firstly, the man was asking about his Frenchman, who the others confirmed was his mate, and then there was mention about how the Kraken attack had stopped for seemingly no apparent reason. He died uttering an ominous truth that the curse didn't just lift on its own. More on that later. Who is this? We don't know. How did they die? Torn apart by a terrible beast. However, looking through the list of names, I could actually work out exactly who this was. Again, he was asking after his mate, the Frenchman, who, looking at the list of names, was Charles Minor, the boatswain's mate, meaning that this gentleman was Alfred Klestel, the boatswain from Austria, with his accent lending credibility to this assumption. This also meant that if we could find Charles in one of the scenes, we could pop his fate into the book as well, as it had just been confirmed he'd been torn apart by the Kraken. I left the scene and found that 4 souls went missing in this chapter, and I had to determine what happened to them. But not now though. Back in the present, I could now enter through another door that had previously been locked and found a shoe caught in a rope dangling out of the window, with a bone hanging out of it. The scene opened up to some chaotic dialogue where an Asian woman was in the process of being harassed and so called out for the captain. As the dialogue ends, a gun fires and we're presented with a man who'd just been shot. The gun the shot was fired from was being held by a man who was currently holding the Asian woman hostage. Down below there was a man crawling across the deck along with Finley Dalton, whose leg had been impaled by a spear, along with a body currently bound, bagged and hanging from the rigging, and Lars Lind holding the back of his head like he'd been struck. Back on the upper deck, I found several of the other Asian passengers being bundled into the lifeboat as if being kidnapped by several other crew members. I then opened the book to page 25, chapter 3, part 3. Who is this? We don't know yet. How did they die? Shot with a gun by an unknown attacker. The next scene opened up through the hanging body, and the dialogue provided a lot of key information.
Hok Seng Lao, you have been found guilty by self-confession of the murder of Nunzio Pasquale.
Quiet.
As captain of this ship, and by the authority of the East India Company, and thus the Crown of England, I sentence you to death by firing line. Mr. Wolf, when you are ready.
Right, sir. Ready, men. Aim. Fire!
After slowly backing up, the scene was instantly recognisable. It was the same scene that had been sketched by the artist Edward Spratt, who we could just about see behind the line of grieving Formosans. Almost the entire ship was present in this moment, and so there was a lot going on and a lot to take in, and before we had a chance to fully analyse the scene, we'd opened the notebook. Who is this? Hok Seng Lao. How did they die? Shot with a gun by... Well, I had to go back into the scene to find out whose bullet it was that actually caused the killing shot. There were 4 rifles that fired, but only 1 that hit, with the 3 other bullets going wide. Following the line of fire from the bullet wound to the rifle, we found the handler to be an already identified face, Henry Brennan. We now had 12 fates sealed into eternity, but there was still a lot of work to do. Back in the scene, I identified this man as Christian Wolf based on the captain's words. Near the back of the group, a man could be seen whispering into the ear of one of the captain's mates, identified by his hat, and then found another man whose face was unblurred, who I had down as Ola's waiter, the gunner's mate. Considering he was standing way off to the side, nowhere near the actual gunner, Mr. Wolf, I determined that this was definitely wrong, along with him not being identified in the last 3 fates that had been sealed. I changed his name to Charles Minor, the boatswain's mate, and left it at that. After this, I found Edward Spratt, sat down and sketching the infamous scene, and then identified the Asian lady, Miss Lim, as Bun Lan Lim. The other two Formosans we still couldn't determine yet. After all that, the pocket watch highlighted a wrapped body lying on the nearby bench, which I'd completely failed to spot, and this took us to our next scene. An Italian man called out to Signor Nichols and asked what was going on down here, as he'd spotted someone who may have been hurt. Nichols assured him everything was fine and offered a hand to steady the investigating Italian. As he took Nichols' treacherous hand, Nichols leant in and stabbed him. Behind us, an unconscious bleeding man lay on the floor beside an opened room. Inside was a chest housing a mysterious looking artifact. The unconscious man turned out to be Hock Seng Lao, the one accused of murdering Nunzio Pasqua. Who is this? Nunzio Pasqua. How did they die? Knifed by Edward Nichols' second mate. We headed back through the portal and into the present, only to head straight back to part 3 of this chapter to have our suspicions that Edward Nichols was the one who kidnapped Miss Lim and shot this guy prove correct. Back in the present, the bottom deck had been opened up and I was able to head down and continue my investigations. A large pool of blood had stained the deck, but other than this and some overturned furniture, everything seemed in order. I then came across a broken barrier and a large animal skull that I could interact with. The dialogue heard an Irishman telling someone else how to properly stun a cow, and then offered to slit the throat afterward. After the kill, a man threw up and was then identified as Charlie. In the scene, the cow was being held down by 3 men, one already known to us. I then turned my attention to the one with the weak stomach and scoured the log for someone named Charlie. There were no Charlies, but 2 Charleses. The first was Charles Minor, whose name we'd already assigned to a body, and Charles Hershtick, an English midshipman. I didn't assign either of the names to the queasy sailor, as I wasn't sure which of the 2 it would be. Further along, we could see 2 of the 4 Formosans sat outside a closed curtain, both with heads turned to their right. Following their gaze, we found 2 men carrying an assumedly dead body up the stairs to the deck above, and a man with a monkey on his shoulder stood idly by. We then opened the book to page 11, chapter 2, part 3. There were no fates to solve in this part. Before moving on to the corpse being dragged up the stairs, I identified this guy as O'Meal O'Farrell, the Irish butcher. In the next scene, some men were talking about the fate of the body and had it penned down to some lung disease, which was the same as the other fellow, meaning somebody else had died of this very same thing. The dead man lay in the bed beside the man with the monkey as a somewhat familiar but unidentified face stood above. Further back, another man had his feet up on the table, and outside of this small room were 2 Indian men sat beside a bundled body, seemingly stricken with grief. Who is this? We don't know. How did they die? He succumbed to a tragic illness. We used this scene to identify this guy as Henry Evans, the surgeon, and this guy as James Wallace, the surgeon's mate, and then moved on to the next body. The scene opened to some Russian men talking about cheating, and then an Indian man calling out to his friend Saeed, trying to get him to wake up, but Saeed wouldn't wake. The man lay in his hammock, labelled number 54, and we knew from the dialogue that his name was Saeed, so we quickly looked through the log, and sure enough, next to number 54 was a Solomon Saeed. I tried to identify the other Indian sat on his hammock, but the label only had a large X. I thought about the Roman numeral 10, but the Indian men were numbered 51 through to 54, so that wasn't right. I was, however, able to identify the other Indian man, the one we'd already seen die, who was still laying in his hammock labelled 51. This was Renfred Rajub. The hammock labelled 53 didn't have anyone in it, so this was assumedly the man standing over Saeed, William Wasim, meaning the hammock labelled X was 52, meaning this guy, the one we'd seen crushed by the Kraken, was Abraham Akbar. Three more fates, signed, sealed, delivered. I then turned my attention to the Russians playing cards, and then had a quick look through the rest of the hammocks to see if I could identify any other men using their numbers, but I wasn't able to determine anything. Who was this? Solomon Saeed. How did they die? Succumbed to a tragic illness. Back in the present, I followed a blood trail around the outside of the ship, which led me to a pile of bones. The dialogue for this scene was ambiguous, with someone shouting,
Someone shoot the damn thing!
the victim had been shot through the wall of the ship. and the dialogue was only ambiguous until I peered through the small window to find a gigantic crab wreaking havoc among the shipmates. I peered through the rest of the windows and stumbled across one of the crew members twisted up against the wall as if he'd been pinned up somehow. We opened the book to page 53, chapter 6, part 7. Who is this? We don't know. How did they die? Assumedly they were shot, but I wasn't 100% sure. The next scene took us to the body pinned against the wall. We already knew who this was. It was O'Farrell the butcher. He'd been stapled to the wall like a pin-up doll. Henry Evans, the doctor, was attempting to get him down. Meanwhile, this guy was pouring water over the seemingly dead crab and crumpled crew member, and around the corner I found the guy from the previous scene who'd managed to crawl away to temporary safety after getting stabbed by one of those projectiles. That explained the blood spatters on the floor. Who is this? Emil O'Farrell. How did they die? Spiked by a terrible beast. The next scene lay with the heap of crab and co. The crab and nameless body were up in flames as crew members watched on helplessly. Peter Milroy plunged his sword into the beast, and as we moved into the next area we were greeted by 2 decapitated corpses, one belonging to someone we didn't yet know and the other belonging to the surgeon's mate, James Wallace. A few steps away, 2 more crew members were peering around the edges, clearly apprehensive about what was looming around the corner. Who is this? We don't know. How did they die? They burned to death. However, I quickly flicked back to the first memory that this guy had shown up in, and it happened to be the one where the cow got slaughtered. I decided to test the 2 Charleses. Charles Minor didn't work, so this must have been Charles Hershtick. 18 fates under our belt, 42 left to go, starting with these decapitated corpses. Another crab being ridden by a ghostly figure dripping with seaweed and curses holds the unfortunate duo in a deadly grasp, and we know exactly how deadly it was. The rest of the crew desperately tried to take out the beast to no avail, with one of the crew being thrown across the room, crashing through the animal pen, which explains the broken barrier. On the other side of the wall, someone was aiming up the stairs with their rifle, and to my dismay, I spotted yet another beast. Who were these? James Wallace and, I don't know, how did they die? Decapitated by a terrible beast. The next scene was through an impaled body found on the decking above. The dialogue heard an American scream at one of the beasts, "Hey, catch!" launching an axe toward the creature, but unfortunately the beast easily deflected the axe, and as quick as lightning fired back a round of spikes, impaling the yank to the wall. Peering around the corners were several crew members cowering away from the beast, and on the top deck was the second crab and several dead crew members. Who was this? We don't know. How did they die? Spiked by a terrible beast. The next scene was on the top deck for this sorry soul. Shouts and screams as a monster climbed over the side of the ship, impaling one of the crew. The rest of the gang watched in horror as their mate was lifted high into the air on the tip of the creature's spear. With their attentions transfixed on this, all but a few failed to spot the other beast quickly heading toward them from behind. Who is this? We don't know. How did they die? Speared by a terrible beast. The next scene took us to the man falling with a demonstrable lack of style. The dialogue heard several crew members working tirelessly as they usually do, but in the blink of an eye, lightning struck. Everything happened in an instant. One moment the crew were working hard to keep the ship afloat, the next one of their own was dead, having taken a lightning bolt to the head, and gigantic creatures were creeping out of the ocean. Who is this? An unknown topman. How did they die? Electrocuted. I wasn't having any luck with these deaths and fates, so I decided to move on to a new chapter, having found someone's tibia still wearing its shoe tucked under the stairs on the lower deck. A familiar voice, assumedly the captain, sounded furious over something that his own steward had done.
What madness is this? 20 years my steward, and never a doubt on your sanity. Explain yourself.
After demanding his steward to explain himself, he replied with an accent, "The beasts carry a curse." The captain demanded others to tie him up and throw him in the lazarette with those things. Henry Evans then said, "All's fine, John. Been in worse spots, I think. Where's the rest of his leg?" The scene played out like you'd expect, with legless John clearly dying from a loss of blood and the steward being carted away. However, up top, one of the senior crew members was stopping the rest from peering down the staircase, and then coming down from the upper deck with some men carrying that chest housing the mysterious artifact. Who is this? Either John Davies or John Naples. How did they die? Killed with a sword by the captain's steward, Philip Dahl. Back upstairs, we find the next scene where a body lay sprawled across the floor, but before jumping into it, I headed to the lower deck again and opened one of the doors to find a gigantic dead crab stowed away. In this vicious, desperate scene, we see one heroic individual giving his life in one final attempt to kill the evil sea creature, and although he lost his life, he definitely won the battle. But the war was not over yet. Who is this? I don't know. How did they die? I put decapitated, but I was wrong. I moved into another cargo hold and found some flies swarming around a barrel, and upon closer inspection I found that there was somebody inside. Somebody was hiding inside this barrel at the moment the crane dropped, killing them. Instantly or not, we will never know. At the same time, it appeared somebody else had been crushed beneath the crane. We opened the book to page 5, chapter 1, part 2, where an unidentified stowaway was crushed inside a falling barrel. The next scene was the other guy. Who is this? I don't know. How did they die? Crushed by falling cargo. Or maybe I do know. Harking back to the moment that Lars Lind was killed by Nathan Peters, we find Peters accusing Lind of killing his brother, assumedly Samuel Peters, the only other Peters on board. Lind defended himself before being clubbed by saying that was an accident, the ropes. From everything we'd seen so far, this was the most likely scenario for this to take place, thus this was Samuel Peters. Realising I just needed to get one more fate before locking in 3 more, I hurried back to the man whose leg had been cut off and tried the 2 Johns again. "21 fates down, 39 to go." In the present, I hurried back to where I'd left chapter 5 and found another sailor whose skull had been crushed, this time by something that resembled a mermaid. We already knew the man William Waseem, and so all we needed to do for him was determine how he died. But before opening the book, we found some additional information. Peering out of a nearby door was the hero who lost his life, carrying a hammer, and inside the room was the American sawing away. This would imply that these 2 men were the resident carpenters. Who is this? William Waseem. How did he die? Crushed by falling cargo. The next body appeared just at the top of the stairs. The dialogue made me assume that the one talking was the cook by the way he said,
Give him to me and I can fry us a solid meal, boys.
Unfortunately, curiosity got the better of him, and as he peered into the netting after spotting a shell, the mermaid struck him across the face, which is what caused the rest of the crew to lose their balance, resulting in the crushing of Waseem. Who is this? Thomas Sefton, the cook. How did he die? Struck dead by a beast's tail. On the upper deck were 2 more dead bodies, so we clocked in to investigate. The captain seemed to be interrogating someone about the chest and his dead friends. There appeared to be someone else translating for him, and the fact that he replied in Formosan seemed to suggest he was one of the remaining 2 of the Formosan royalty. He shouted that the shell must be protected or else they'd all die. The mermaids had been hoisted into the air and in a fit of rage launched several spikes at the crew members. One landed just beneath the captain's feet, one just missed the bosun, and the other pierced the Formosan and his restrainer and translator. Who is this? I don't know, and I don't know. How did they die? Spiked by a terrible beast. I decided to hazard a guess though on the identity of this man based on the fact that he could communicate with the Formosan. He didn't look Chinese to me, so didn't guess he was any of the Chinamen, and me being an idiot and not realising that Sierra Leone was actually in West Africa made me guess, and it turns out it very much was a guess, that this was Hamadou Dione. 24 fates down, 36 to go. I then turned my attention to the 3 corpses laid upon the deck, paying special attention to this one. Edward Nichols had rowed himself back to the Obra Dinn, declaring that he yields and has treasure, but is ultimately shot and killed even after the command was given to not fire. In the rowboat was the chest and a dead Formosan, and in tow was a second rowboat with a dead Miss Lim, 2 mermaids and a shell. The Formosan in Nichols' boat seemed to be missing an arm, or at least the flesh and blood of one, and inside the ship was the final Formosan who had died in the previous scene. Who is this? Edward Nichols. How did he die? Shot with a gun by an unknown attacker. I turned my attention to the now left-handed Formosan and jumped into the next scene. Out at sea, Nichols could be seen pulling one of the mermaids into the boat as the Formosan lay dying beside him, with his arm having been set ablaze and the shell missing from its compartment of the chest. Who is this? I don't know. How did they die? I also don't really know. The next fate to determine was Miss Lim's. The Formosan seemed to have plunged his arm into the top of the chest, perhaps containing some form of volatile liquid, and in doing so apparently killed, or at the very least stunned, the attacking mermaids. Nichols lay cowering in the same boat as Miss Lim as she lay still, blood pouring from her neck, and bodies had piled up in both of the boats. Who is this? Bunlan Lim? How did she die? I'm not 100% sure. The next scene was through this guy. The Formosan had lunged at the kidnapper and stabbed him as the rest of the crew were savaged by the mermaids, and Nichols lay cowering like a snivelling child, and we also managed to get a very clear picture as to what happened to Miss Lim. Who is this? I don't know. How did they die? Stabbed, but I didn't put it in yet. The next scene opened up to this important piece of dialogue.
Keep rowing!
Where is it? There! Something there!
I see it!
Here's a weapon!
Shoot it! My kid eye! Pick up the oars and row, you fools!
Before the mermaids laid their claws on the crew, they attacked from afar using spears, with one catching this guy right in the neck. I was able to update Miss Lim's death record to clawed by a terrible beast, and now had enough information to determine who this Formosan was. Based on Miss Lim's call, this was It Beng Sia, and he'd burned to death. This also meant I knew the identity of the final Formosan, Chow Tan. "27 fates down, 33 to go. Immediately, I jotted down Nichols' fate to being shot by Chow Tan and headed back into the scene. Beng could be seen using a spear lodged into one of his captors to cut the ropes binding his hands, and further chaos ensued across the boats. Who is this? I don't know. How did they die? Speared by a terrible beast. The next scene was through It Beng's lockpick. The dialogue was calm, with Nichols going over their plans to reach the Canaries within 3 days. They had no idea what kind of chaos was about to unfold. The Formosans were discussing the current state of affairs, and one of the crew members, understanding what they had just said, relayed this to the rest of them. They say strange things.
About monsters!
A mermaid had popped her head out of the water and launched a spear at this guy. Who is this? I don't know. How did they die? Speared by a terrible beast. I climbed back through the magic portal into the present and was beckoned by the ferryman who'd brought me to the Obra Dinn.
Boy! Get in there somewhere! Storm's coming! Finish your business and climb down here!
He was right. I had seen everything there was to see aboard the Obra Dinn, so it was time to put my detective hat on and figure out the remaining 32 fates. I just wanted to quickly take the time to say thank you for sticking with the video so far. We've still got a ways to go before the end, which I hope you'll enjoy as much as you enjoyed the first act. If you're not yet subscribed and you are enjoying the video, then please consider subscribing to help us achieve our first 1,000 subscribers, and it would mean the world to me if you did. Flicking through the book right back to the very beginning, I made a shocking discovery. Something that I'd forgotten about entirely. The preface asked me to fill out the book and then send it to the French Office of Affairs in Morocco and was signed by Henry Evans, the surgeon. I quickly headed to chapter 9, found Henry Evans and updated his fate to alive in Africa. I then began to flick through the rest of the book from the beginning to see if I could determine anyone else's fate that I'd missed. I found the American who'd been speared and headed to chapter 5 part 3 where I could see him hard at work in the carpenter's workshop. Knowing that in his death scene he referred to somebody else as boss, I determined that this must have been Marcus Gibbs, the carpenter's mate. "30 fates down, 30 to go." Halfway there. That meant that this was Winston Smith, the carpenter. I then turned my attention to the two women who left in the rowboat with Henry Evans and determined that if he was alive and well in Africa, then so were they. And so was this guy. But who was who? I tried guessing, but neither of the names worked, but I was sure I'd gotten their fates right. In this moment, I didn't think to flick back to Winston to check if his fate was correct, so I headed back to the death scene of Abigail, the captain's wife, because she actually named someone in the dialogue. She calls out to a man named Martin, and according to the logbook, there was only one Martin on board who happened to be the third mate. In the scene, there was a man right next to Abigail as the rigging fell on her head, and based on the type of hat he was wearing in his portrait, similar to Hoskett and Nicholls' hats, both first and second mates, I determined that this was Martin. However, I didn't know what Martin's fate was, but the fact that there were only 4 mates and 3 had been identified meant that I could find the last one wearing a mate's hat in the sketch and identify him as John Davies. "33 fates down, 27 to go." However, if you didn't want to guess between the two women, you can identify which one is a Mrs. by this very scene, as you can see a wedding ring here. I headed over to the bosun, who we know got his arm ripped off and bled out, and determined that the man next to him was Charles Minor, the bosun's mate. I then headed back to the scene where the bosun died and had it confirmed in the dialogue that Charles Minor was torn apart by the Kraken, which we already knew. I flicked through the book again and found the 2 gentlemen that were blasted by a cannon and changed both of their fates to blasted with a cannon by Abraham Akbar, as he was the one who'd actually lit the cannon. Again, flicking through the book, I identified the crazed leg slicer as Philip Dahl, the captain's steward, and then headed back toward the mutiny section to where the guy got his head blasted to smithereens. We knew who the killer was in this section, John Davies, the 4th mate, and so hazarded a guess based on the outfit and proximity to the gunner during the sketch that this was Ola's waiter, the gunner's mate. "36 fates down, 24 to go." I flicked back to Winston Smith's page as I was confused why his fate hadn't yet been sealed, but I still didn't make any changes. I headed to the scene where Peter Milroy got blown up and found on the other side a man falling through the air into the sea. I made an assumption on his appearance that this was Omid Ghul the Persian and determined he'd been drowned by a terrible beast. I headed then to another scene where someone unknown had been crushed by a loose cannon and tried to determine based on his accent in the dialogue who it was. I was getting it wrong though, so left it alone for the time being. Back in the scene where Abigail dies, I found someone I hadn't seen before climbing the rigging as a giant tentacle wrapped around him. I could only determine that he had been torn apart by the beast. Next, in the scene where the artist died whilst defecating over the ship's edge, I found the third mate Martin walking alongside the boy who we'd just seen crushed by the cannon. This made me think that he must be the third mate's steward, Roderick Anderson. I then headed back to the scene where Mabba had been ripped in half and spotted a rowboat that had been lifted into the air, sprinkling its 3 inhabitants into the tempestuous waters. I then went to a previous scene where Peters clubbed Lars Lind and found the same rowboat with 3 passengers boarding. I changed all of their fates to drowned by a terrible beast and then spotted that one of them was clutching a bunch of papers or ledgers. This made me think that he was the ship's purser, Duncan McKay. After this, I finally headed back to Winston Smith's death and realised that he hadn't been decapitated at all. He'd been speared. Next, I headed to the outside of the ship where the man who'd been spiked had crawled all the way around the outside only to be shot through the wall. From what I could see through the small window, the only one pointing a gun in this direction with a vague bullet trajectory was Charles Minor. I then headed to the scene just before the Russian guy got blasted in the chest to remind myself who it was that blasted him, Emily Jackson. Then, using process of elimination, I figured out this guy was Leonid Volkov, and he was the one who'd plunged a sword into Paul Moss. Next, I headed back to the scene where Olus Waiter stabbed this poor guy in the back, and I determined by cross-referencing the ship's map along with where he crawled to die, that this must be a midshipman, and the only midshipman we had left on board was Thomas Lank. I then headed out to sea, back to the scenes with the mermaids, and determined that this guy had been knifed by It Beng Seer, and based on his accent,
You're still breathing? Can you roll?
I determined he was Timothy Butemont, the Scot. I then determined that the dead man in the other boat was Patrick O'Hagan, based on the dialogue of his name being called. Lastly, I determined that this guy had been drowned by a terrible beast, and if the rest of the crew's nationalities had been determined, and there was at least one Russian on board, based on the dialogue he was either Alarkus Nikishin or Alexei Toporov. However, the one I determined to be Timothy Butemont was incorrect. I quickly opened the book again and found the third and final Russian who also appeared in this scene and was drowned by a terrible beast, Alarkus Nikishin. I then realised that this guy wasn't Timothy Butemont, but actually Samuel Galligan, Edward Nichols' steward, which made sense due to the fact he was here, helping Nichols kidnap the Formosans. The last person aboard these boats was someone who could understand the language of the Formosans, so I determined and assumed he would be Chinese. I selected Li Hong. Flicking through the faces in the book, I made some assumptions based on appearance. I jotted down that this guy was Zungi Sati from India, this guy was Wei Li from China, and this guy was Ye Zhang. I then headed to the scene where they'd hoisted the mermaid into the air and realised that Hamadou Diom wasn't the one translating for the Formosan at all, it was the Chinaman stood beside them. The only Chinaman left to name was Huang Li. I headed back to the hanging of the Formosan and found this chap cowering beside the fourth mate, so determined he was Davy James, and then headed to the scene where Nichols blasted this guy, and based on his accent, I determined he was Timothy Buland. "54 fates down, 6 to go." The next identities, I won't lie, I just swapped the names around until I got it right, but this time it only gave me 2 fates and not 3. Again, I just swapped these names around until I got them right, and again only 2 fates were needed. There were just 2 crew members left. We knew who both of them were, Martin Perrault, the third mate, and Philip Dahl, the captain's steward. The last we knew of Dahl was that he was thrown into the lazarette after cutting off another man's leg, but Perrault, we had absolutely no idea. Back in the present, the rain had started to fall, and so we climbed down the ladder, sat in the rowboat, and headed back to the shore.
Finally! Sit down so you don't fall out.
A week later, the insurance investigation had concluded and the findings were presented to the relevant parties. Each crew member's family and estate was either fined or awarded based on their actions on the ship. Some notable mentions: Captain Wittrell murdered 4 crewmates, his estate was forfeited to the Crown. Edward Nichols murdered 2 crewmates, attempted mutiny and stole cargo, his estate fined £100. Henry Evans abandoned crew and vessel, however his estate was awarded his outstanding wages. Winston Smith exhibited extraordinary valour, his estate awarded outstanding wages and reward of £60. Nunzio Pasqua, no claims made. Philip Dahl, murder of 1 crewmate and failure to perform duties, his estate fined £35. Finally, the document was signed, the claim was awarded, and the investigation was completed.
Right, well, get yourself home then. And tell Martha I said hello. Can you believe it? A package at this hour? Oh, the thing smells just dreadful. Better you don't open it inside. I'll be turning in now. Tea's in the kitchen if you need more.
Chief Inspector, I write to you with the unfortunate news that Dr. Evans has passed away. He succumbed to his illness shortly after receiving your package. He was very pleased with your correspondence and asked that his gratitude be expressed by returning the book to you along with the means to complete it. As for the three of us that remain, the Obra Dinn is a distant memory and a dreadful chapter in our lives that we wish to forget. Do not write back. Regards, Jane Bird. After reading the letter, I opened the book to see a note left by Evans telling me to complete the story. I flipped to chapter 8 and realised we hadn't yet completed it. I quickly turned my attention to the other package lying on the table, the one that the landlady said smelt awful, to find a rotting monkey paw. I pulled out the stopwatch for the final time.
There you are. Collect your things. Where's the key? To that door. Gone. Damn. There's no time. We need to go. Right.
There you go.
What are you up to?
Nothing good. We were now inside the locked lazarette. Evans had killed his pet monkey, and on either side of the room were two bodies, likely Perot and Dahl. We flipped the book to page 103, chapter 8, part 5. A friendly but not entirely pleasant monkey companion was sacrificed in the pursuit of knowledge. The next body was Perot's.
A third shell! Captain didn't toss them all! Leave it! Help me lift it! Stop! Why? Well, set you free! Give it the shell! Eh? Do it! Hoist it out. To the main deck. Throw it over. Lock the door when you leave. Get the tail, boy. In return, the ship. The Obra Dinn. See it home.
Perot had been taken out by one of the mermaids as he attempted to set it free along with the last remaining magic shell. The scene itself was a bloodbath, but it was very apparent what had happened. Who is this? Martin Perot. How did he die? Spiked by a terrible beast. The next body, though, wasn't Dahl's, but one of the mermaids.
I'll kill every last one of you monsters! Withdraw the Kraken, or I will kill you all!
The captain can be seen spearing the creature. A captured beast fought against its jailer and was speared for the trouble. The next body was another mermaid.
Call it off, damn you! This is your Kraken! You brought it here! Send it back!
The captain can be seen firing his pistol into the cage, killing the mermaid at point-blank range. Dahl sits, slumped against the wall with his hand burnt clean off, and a shell sat on his lap. And Unholy creature's defiant shrieks were greeted with a fatal bullet. And finally, we turn to Dahl's corpse.
What's this? Quicksilver.
According to the dialogue, it sounded as if Dahl broke free of his restraints to investigate the Formosan chest, and upon opening it, plunged his hand into the vat and pulled out the shell that Itbeng Seer had plunged in there. Who is this? Philip Dahl. How did he die? He burned to death. All fates have been sealed in the book and the game has been completed, but it is now time to retell the story in chronological order. But before we do, if you've enjoyed the video so far, please consider subscribing here on YouTube and following over on Twitch, as we're still on our journey to 1,000 subscribers and 50 followers respectively. With all that said, it is time for Act 3, the chronology. Immediately after setting sail from Falmouth, as the crew was still moving crates of cargo around, Samuel Peters tragically lost his life when a huge pallet carrying heavy cargo was accidentally dropped from above, crushing him to death. In the same moment, an unidentified stowaway also lost their life as they were hiding in one of the barrels that killed Samuel Peters. Nobody actually discovered the body, and it remained in the barrel in the ship's hold up until the Obra Dinn returned in 1807. Just off the coast of Portugal, a group of Indian men gather around their comrade Solomon Said as he slowly succumbs to an illness, likely picked up during their stint in the Lascar House, which was a place in England that housed Indian sailors. Renfred Rajoub also dies at the cruel hands of the infection, but as none of the other crew members are sick, the infection died with the hosts. From where the bodies have been bagged, a group of men, including the butcher Emil O'Farrell, are in the process of butchering a cow for its meat. As the ship passes by the Canary Islands, Edward Nichols, the second mate, is up to no good below deck. As Hokseng Lao, a bodyguard for the Formosan royalty, stands guard of the Formosan clan's treasure, Nichols strikes him down, rendering him unconscious. As Nichols is in the process of stealing the Formosan treasure, a large shell kept in the bottom drawer of a chest, Nundio Pasqua, a talented violinist, is in the wrong place at the wrong time, and sees Hokseng Lao passed out on the floor. In a panic, Nichols plunges a knife into Pasqua and flees. Soon after, it is determined by apparent self-confession that Hokseng Lao is the one who is guilty of murdering Pasqua, much to the protest of Bun Lan Lim, the Formosan princess, who is adamant Hokseng Lao is innocent. Captain Robert Whittrell gives the order to Christian Wolfe, who proceeds to take the reins. The firing squad take aim and fire. Only one of the bullets actually makes impact with the dangling Hokseng Lao, and it comes from the firearm of Henry Brennan. Not long after, Nichols and a group of bandits kidnap the Formosan royalty along with their treasure and set sail in 2 small rowboats bound for the Canary Islands. After knocking out a few crew members and spearing another, Timothy Butemont makes one last attempt to put a stop to Nichols' heinous crimes, but is swiftly taken care of with a gunshot to the chest. His foot gets caught in one of the ropes and he dies dangling upside down over the side of the ship. With an eastern trajectory set, the small band of criminals begin a 3-day journey towards the Canary Islands. Miss Lim warns Itbeng Seer that the chest cannot fall into the ocean, and Beng tells her to watch out for any monsters that may show up. As soon as he finishes speaking, Li Hong is speared through the chest by a sea monster, narrowly missing Beng. The crew, unprepared for such an attack, are completely caught off guard, and so the monsters have an incredible advantage. Miss Lim shouts to Beng to watch for the chest and he tells her to stay down. The next to lose his life is Patrick O'Hagan, who takes a spear through the jaw. Meanwhile, Beng cuts himself free from his ropes using the spear end that killed Li Hong, and Alarcus Nikishin is dragged under the water and drowned by the sea monster, dropping his knife in the process. Whilst the sea monsters continue to ravage the small fleet and its motley crew, Beng sweeps up the knife dropped by Nikishin and plunges it into Samuel Gallagher's neck, killing him. Meanwhile, as Edward Nichols cowers beneath the seats, Alexei Toporov suffers the same fate as Nikishin, being dragged beneath the waves and drowned, and Miss Lim has her throat torn to shreds by another monster. Beng takes the shell from the bottom drawer of the chest and plunges it into a vat of liquid located at the top of the chest. This releases a bright burst of energy that neutralizes the sea monsters, but tragically, as Beng calls out for Miss Lim, hoping that his sacrifice saved her life, he passes on due to being burned alive by the energy blast. With the monsters subdued, his crew gone, and the Formosan royalty dead, Edward Nichols hoists the monsters into the boats along with their shells and heads back to the Obra Dinn in hopes of being pardoned of his crimes due to him returning with valuable treasure. As he approaches the ship, he's met with the barrel of a gun held by the last remaining Formosan, Chow Tan. Even though the call to cease fire was made, Chow Tan ignores it and blasts Nichols in the chest, killing him. After the bodies of It Beng Seer, Bun Lan Lim and Edward Nichols are lifted aboard, the crew get to work in hoisting the sea monsters up in a large net. Chow Tan is seized by Hamadou Diom and the captain attempts to draw answers from Tan. Tan warns of the dangers of the shell and how it must be protected at all costs, but as the captain asks what shell he's referring to, one of the monsters swings their tail, launching large spikes at the crew, one of which pierces Chow Tan, passing clean through him and into Hamadou Diom, simultaneously killing them. As the crew splits in two, one half taking the monsters below deck and the other unloading the chest and examining the dead, the ship's cook, Thomas Sefton, gets a little too cocky and a bit too close for comfort. He notices a shell among the heap of monsters before being cracked across the face, with the monster's tail dying instantly. In the background of the struggle, Philip Dahl can be seen fleeing from the scene. As the monster cracks Sefton across the face, it causes the crew to lose their footing and grip, and William Wasim is crushed by the netting carrying the monsters. A little while later, with the monsters currently locked away in the lazarette, a small group of men, including the ship's surgeon Henry Evans, attempt to keep John Naples alive after Philip Dahl, the captain's steward, sliced his leg clean off. The captain deems Dahl insane and instructs the crew to lock him away in a lazarette with the monsters, but not before Dahl cries out,
"Those ungodly beasts carry a curse! Throw them back or doom us all!"
As the ship begins to change course and head back toward Falmouth, a storm begins to pick up. The top deck crew attempt to keep the ship at bay and under control. As the rain picks up, lightning tears the sky in two and strikes Huang Li, who was scurrying across the rigging, frying him to a crisp and plunging him down to the decking below. As the lightning lightens up the sky, monstrous figures can be seen scaling the side of the ship. As Huang Li falls through the air, giant monstrous crabs with riders covered in seaweed climb aboard the ship with only one thing on their minds: blood. As the crew scrambles away from the beasts, Nicholas Bottrell isn't so lucky and is speared through the chest and hoisted into the air like a flag, much to the horror of his comrades. As the monsters make their way below deck, the crew scatter to find a weapon of their own in an effort to defend the ship and themselves. Marcus Gibbs, the carpenter's mate, throws his axe in a last-ditch attempt, which is deflected as easily as swatting away a fly, and in return is nailed to the ship with a deadly spike. Winston Smith becomes collateral damage and takes a spike to the shoulder. As the monsters continue their journey below deck, James Wallace and Yi Zhang attempt to fend them off but are quickly decapitated by the monster's large claws. As this is happening, Charles Hirschtick launches a lantern at the beast in an effort to set it ablaze. Zungi Sati takes a spike to the back in the battle. The men scramble around doing their best to pick up the artillery from the weapons hold and relaying it to the other crew members. As the men take aim, Nathan Peters grabs Smith and hides him behind the partition in an effort to conceal them both from the beast, preventing any further injury, and this act of combined cowardice and bravery may just have saved the ship. Hirschtick jumps on top of the beast, taking a spike to the chest, sacrificing himself in an effort to keep the monster at bay, as Peter Milroy plunges a sword into the monster. Alfred Klestel sprints over in a race against the clock with a large, aggressive-looking firearm. Smith and Peters make it down the stairs just in time to watch their crewmate burn alive atop the giant crown. In a counter, the beast fires off more projectile spears, pinning the butcher, Emil O'Farrell, to the wall as Zungi Sati continues to drag himself to safety. With the beast dead, the crew compose themselves before taking on the second one just across the ship. Milroy then puts out the fire. Even though he's wounded, Smith asks for the large firearm held by Klestel. Henry Evans attempts to lift O'Farrell off the wall. Peters opens up the hatch below as a place to store the giant sea monster, and Sati, having made his way to safety, removes the spike from his back and hobbles along the decking on the outside of the ship. The crew continue to rage against the final beast and give it everything that they've got. Charles Minor, Klestel's mate, fires a rogue bullet, and in the heat of the battle it doesn't mean much other than a missed target. However, Sati is resting on the other side of the wall, and the careless, stray bullet penetrates the wall and passes clean through Sati, killing him. Lastly, even with a fatal wound, Smith is able to take down the monster with a large firearm he took from Klestel. Had Nathan Peters not protected him beforehand, Smith wouldn't be here now to put a stop to the monster's rampage. But in the battle, the monster managed to land a killing blow of its own, spearing Smith, and the two died together, man and beast, friend and foe. A small group of men, Alexander Booth, Duncan Mackay and Nathan Peters, are attempting to leave the ship on one of the rowboats brought back by Edwin Nichols. As Lars Lind attempts to climb aboard, Peters denies him a seat, stating that Lind is the one who killed his brother Samuel, the man who was crushed by the falling cargo in Chapter 1. Lind denies the allegations, saying that it wasn't his fault, and Booth, who has stood right next to Samuel as he died, vouches for him. Peters refuses to listen and in a fit of rage clubs Lind to death, much to the shock and horror of Booth and Mackay. Another murder is the least of the ship's worries though, because in the dead of night, as everyone sleeps and drinks, Edward Spratt loses his life in the most vulnerable position possible. As he defecates off the front of the ship, a beast bigger than any we've seen before looms below the surface of the water. Slowly the beast's tentacles creep up behind Spratt and crush him to death, alerting Paul Moss not only to the disgusting sounds of bodily fluids being spilled all across the deck, but also to the gargantuan presence of their final foe, the Kraken. With what's left of the crew fully alert to the presence of the Titan, they begin to load the cannons in an attempt to fend off the vicious predator. As a tentacle breaks through the side of the ship, 3 men are trapped in a deadly constriction, with Abraham Akbar being crushed to death in the grip of the tentacle, and Christian Wolfe and George Shirley unaware that they're staring down the barrel of a loaded cannon that could go off at any second. As they attempt to break free from the Kraken's deadly grip, the cannon fires, having been lit by Akbar's torch, killing both of them instantly. The crew begin to believe that they have the upper hand, but what they fail to realise, however, is that the cannons are not tied down, and if the Kraken tips the boat even slightly, the friendly weapon will very quickly become a deadly rolling enemy, which Roderick Anderson learned the hard way as he was crushed and instantly killed. On the main deck, Thomas Lank and Peter Milroy, who have tied themselves together in an effort to rescue one another should the time call for it, attempt to fend off the beast. However, Milroy is lifted into the air by the Kraken, and even though Lank made every effort to pull him back, it was of no use, and made the call to blow up the Kraken with gunpowder, killing Milroy in the process. In the background, Omid Ghoul falls overboard due to the unstable ground of the ship and drowns. As Olaus Waiter and John Davies climb up the stairs, Mabba clings on for dear life, failing to notice the creeping tentacle looming just around the corner. As Mabba is torn completely in half, the crew is thrown into complete disarray, with crew members being launched in every direction. The 3 men that had attempted to abandon ship were launched sky high from their rowboat and were drowned upon landing in the raging ocean. The crew attempt to vanquish the beast in any and every way they know how. Whether that be spears, gunpowder or artillery, the crew put up a good fight against the Kraken, but it wasn't good enough, and nobody could have seen what was coming next. The crew continued to get ravaged by the Kraken, with Finlay Dalton and Whaley being torn limb from limb. Alfred Klestel had his arm ripped off, and the women Emily Jackson and Jane Bird watch in horror as Abigail Hosgood Whittrell, the captain's wife, is crushed by a piece of the ship's mast. Philip Dahl, locked in the lazarette with the Formosan chest and 3 cages, each containing one of the beasts, opens the chest and finds what he thinks to be a vat of quicksilver bubbling away, and proceeds to reach in and pull out the shell that Itbeng Sia had originally placed inside, thus suffering the same fate as Beng, being burned alive. With Philip dead, the captain storms into the lazarette in a fit of rage and confronts the caged creatures. He demands that they call off the Kraken, blasting the first creature with his pistol. Again, he demands that they call off the Kraken, this time threatening to kill every last one of them whilst piercing the second creature with a spear. Before the captain can slaughter the third and final creature, he leaves the lazarette, assumedly because his wife has just died on the main deck. Whilst the captain is out, Martin Perot, Paul Moss and Davy James sneak into the lazarette in an effort to release the creature. Whilst the men lift the cage to the last prison cell, the creature spikes Perot and causes him to stumble backwards and collapse. He tells the creature that they are going to release it and tells the men to give the shell that Dahl had pulled out of the chest back to the creature and to toss it overboard and to lock him inside the lazarette. He then asks the creature to get the ship back to Falmouth in return for setting it free. Once the door is locked, Perot dies in the heart of the ship, locked away from everyone and everything, with nobody to determine his bravery, valour and sacrifice. Paul Moss catches Henry Evans attempting to get into the lazarette, but tells him the key is long gone as he is the one who locked the doors. Moss tells Evans they need to leave now, and Evans says he just needed to do one last thing. He sends the monkey through the barred window into the lazarette and then proceeds to shoot it. Although the monkey was Evans' friend, he knew that for anyone to determine what happened on this ship, specifically this chapter, then the monkey needed to die in the lazarette so the pocket watch could be used on it. This is why he'd tied a rope to the monkey before sending him in, so he could pull him back out again. In the aftermath of the Kraken's attack, what's left of the ship's crew collect their thoughts and attempt to recuperate. Alfred Klestel is taken below deck by Olus Waiter and John Davies and given a chair. He asks where his mate Charles Minor is, who Waiter tells him was ripped to pieces by the Kraken. With his arm having been torn off, he bleeds out, but not before telling the two men that there's no way the Kraken just disappeared on its own. Something must have happened to make it disappear like that. Above deck, a group of passengers attempt to leave the ship on the last rowboat. Emily Jackson, Jane Bird, Davy James, Paul Moss and Henry Evans are all ready to leave when Leonid Volkov attempts to stop them. Paul steps in to defend them, but not before Volkov plunges a sword through his chest, killing him. As Volkov attempts to take back the rowboat, the captain draws his gun to shoot him, having mercy on those trying to flee. But before he can fire his weapon, Volkov is blasted by Emily Jackson at point-blank range, leaving a gaping hole in his chest. The group of passengers make it away from the ship and sail for Africa, specifically Morocco, as the captain stands with his head in his hands in utter disbelief over what has befallen his ship and absolute grief over the death of his beloved wife. Meanwhile, below deck, a conspiracy is brewing as Waiter declares the captain cannot be trusted and suggests to Davies that the rest of the crew conduct a revolt. He wants to take the ship and sail east and make a living selling fish and shells. Upon revealing this information, he notices there's a spy peeking around the corner, and as he confronts the shadowed figure, revealed to be Thomas Lank, Lank cries out, "Mutiny." To shut him up, he plunges a knife into his back, but after doing this, Davis grabs Waiter's gun that was tied to his waist and shoots him in the face at point-blank range. Whilst all this is going on downstairs, the crew above begin to move below deck to figure out what all the noise is about. As they head downstairs, Brennan clubs Davies clean across the head, killing him as Hoscut looks on to find Lank crawling away, trailing a huge pool of blood. As Hoscut consoles Lank in his final moments, his dying wish is that Hoscut tells Peter Milroy's mother that he tried his best to pull him back during the Kraken attack. Hoscut does everything he can to get Lank patched up, shouting for Brennan to get the surgeon's kit, but to no avail. Lank dies in Hoscut's arms. And now we return to the beginning of the tale, to when we first set foot onto the Obra Dinn. William Hoscut, the captain's brother-in-law and friend, rallies his comrades and attempts to storm the captain's crib. They demand the captain open the door, otherwise they'll break it down and take more than just a couple of shells. The captain flings the door open and fires straight at Hoscut without hesitation. Henry Brennan rushes the captain, demanding to know where the shells are, to which the captain retorts, "They're at the bottom of the sea." Not believing the captain, Brennan plunges a spear through his shoulder, but the captain still manages to trump Brennan and slashes his neck with a knife. At the same time, Lewis Walker has jumped in from behind and attempts to take out the captain by surprise and lands a knife blow to the captain's ribs. But the captain is stronger than he looks, and though he has a knife in the rib, he uses the spear to cave in Walker's skull. With everyone on board either missing or dead, the captain turns the gun to himself and speaks his final words to his wife, Abigail.
Abigail, your brother, my friend, I shot him dead. I'll be with you soon, my love. Please forgive me for everything.
He pulls the trigger and joins her in the afterlife. And with that, every fate of the Obra Dinn is sealed within the pages of the book, and you place it on your shelf. It sits comfortably beside your other insurance investigations and relics from previous mysteries. To conclude, the tragedy of the Obra Dinn cannot be fully pinned on one person, and there are many at fault for the events that came to pass. The Formosan clan, who kept the treasure a secret, endangering the lives of all on board by having the shell on board to begin with. The several crew members who went on a murder spree. The captain for executing an innocent man and killing his last remaining crewmates. Whilst it's difficult to point the blame fully at any one person, as almost every crew member harboured a dark secret or motive, there is one thing that we can all agree on and be absolutely sure of. Edward Nichols is the freaking worst. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then do be sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date on all future videos. Make sure to follow me over on Twitch, where I stream every Monday as well. I'll catch you in the next video. Goodbye.